Beneath the designer clothes and picture-perfect smile of New York's most envied socialite lay a truth so profound that it would shake her world to its core. What Victoria Maxwell discovered that autumn morning on a humble farm would not only change her life forever, but force her to question everything she had ever believed about wealth, happiness, and the true meaning of abundance. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Maxwells' penthouse overlooked Central Park, a $50 million testament to her husband Richard's success in the world of high-frequency trading. From her private terrace on the 87th floor, Victoria could watch the entire city pulse beneath her feet like a living organism of concrete and steel. She had claimed this spot as her sanctuary, though lately it felt more like a watchtower of her gilded prison. Victoria's days revolved around an endless carousel of charity galas, luxury spa treatments, and managing their various properties across the country. Her Instagram feed painted the picture of perfection: private jet travels, exclusive fashion shows in Paris, intimate dinners with celebrities, and morning yoga sessions with views that made her millions of followers swoon with envy. From the outside, she was living every woman's dream. Married to one of New York's most eligible bachelors, featured in society magazines, and never having to check a price tag. Richard Maxwell had swept her off her feet 7 years ago, when she was still a promising young art curator at the Metropolitan Museum. He was different then, passionate about life, excited to share his dreams with her, and always making time for spontaneous weekend getaways. But success had a way of changing people, and the man who once wrote her love poems on restaurant napkins now communicated primarily through his assistant's carefully worded emails. Their penthouse, despite its stunning views and perfect decoration, felt more like a museum than a home. Every piece was carefully selected by their interior designer, every artwork chosen to appreciate in value, every room staged like a magazine photo shoot. Victoria couldn't remember the last time anyone had actually sat in their living room or cooked a meal in their state-of-the-art kitchen. But lately, something had begun to shift within her. The endless parties felt hollow, the conversations superficial. At charity galas, she found herself zoning out during discussions about the latest hedge fund successes or which private school was most prestigious. Her marriage to Richard had devolved into parallel lives lived under the same roof. He was always away on business, and when home, seemed more interested in his phone than in her. Their conversations, once filled with dreams and laughter, now centered around social obligations and property investments. The breaking point came during their 7th wedding anniversary. Victoria had planned an intimate dinner at home, something they hadn't done in years. She spent the afternoon arranging everything perfectly, even attempting to cook his favorite pasta dish herself, a task that proved more challenging than expected in their barely used kitchen. But as the evening wore on and the carefully prepared food grew cold, Richard's assistant called to inform her that he was stuck in an emergency board meeting in Singapore via video conference. That night, as Victoria sat alone at their dining table for 12, she noticed her reflection in the polished silver centerpiece, a woman she barely recognized anymore. Her perfectly styled hair, designer dress, and flawless makeup couldn't hide the emptiness in her eyes. She had everything money could buy, but she couldn't remember the last time she'd felt truly alive. The next morning, Victoria found herself scrolling through old photos on her phone, pictures from before their marriage, when she used to spend weekends exploring small art galleries in Brooklyn, having genuine conversations with emerging artists and feeling passionate about making a difference in the art world. Back then, her apartment had been a tiny studio in the East Village, but it had felt more like home than this sprawling penthouse ever did. Richard's voice interrupted her reverie. "The Harrison Farm property in Vermont. Have you scheduled the inspection?" he asked without looking up from his tablet. Victoria blinked, trying to remember which property he was referring to. They owned so many now, most of them investments she'd never even seen. "I'll handle it today," she replied automatically, but something about the question nagged at her. This particular property had been on their acquisition list for months, a struggling family farm that Richard's company planned to convert into luxury vacation homes. Victoria had been putting off dealing with it, making excuses about scheduling conflicts and bad weather. As she stood alone on their balcony that evening, watching the city lights flicker below, Victoria made a decision. Tomorrow she would drive to Vermont herself to inspect the Harrison farm. No assistants, no real estate agents, no entourage. She needed to get out of this tower in the sky, even if just for a day. Little did she know that this simple decision would set in motion events that would completely transform her life and challenge everything she thought she knew about wealth, happiness, and what truly matters in life. The drive to Vermont was unlike anything Victoria had experienced in years. Gone were the chauffeur-driven luxury cars and private jets that had become her normal mode of transportation. Instead, she found herself behind the wheel of her rarely used Range Rover, watching the urban sprawl of New York gradually give way to rolling hills and autumn-painted landscapes. 3 hours into her journey, as her GPS guided her through increasingly narrow country roads, Victoria realized she couldn't remember the last time she'd been alone like this. No assistant scheduling her next appointment, no social media team documenting her every move, no Richard asking about investment portfolios. The silence felt both foreign and strangely comforting. Harrison Farm appeared before her as she rounded a bend, a sprawling 100-acre property nestled in a valley between two gentle hills. The morning mist was just lifting, revealing an old but well-maintained farmhouse, several barns and fields dotted with what looked like organic crops. It was nothing like the manicured estates she was used to, but there was something undeniably alive about the place. As Victoria pulled up to the gravel driveway, she noticed a woman in her early 40s working in what appeared to be a vegetable garden. Sarah Harrison looked nothing like the failing farmer Victoria had imagined from Richard's business reports. Dressed in well-worn jeans and a flannel shirt, her face weathered but bright with health, she radiated a quiet confidence that caught Victoria off guard. "Welcome to Harrison Farm," Sarah called out, wiping her hands on her jeans as she approached the car. "You must be Mrs. Maxwell. We weren't expecting you until next week, and certainly not in person." There was no trace of bitterness in her voice, despite knowing that Victoria's husband's company was trying to buy her family's land. Victoria found herself suddenly self-conscious of her designer outfit and impractical shoes. "I hope it's not an inconvenience," she replied, trying to maintain her usual poise. "I thought it would be good to see the property personally." Sarah's warm smile never wavered. "No inconvenience at all. Would you like a tour? Though I should warn you, it might get your shoes a bit muddy." There was a gentle teasing in her voice that made Victoria smile despite herself. As they walked the property, Victoria was struck by how Sarah spoke about the farm. It wasn't just land and buildings to her. It was a living, breathing entity with its own story. She pointed out the apple orchard her great-grandfather had planted, the barn her children had learned to walk in, the fields where they were experimenting with sustainable farming techniques. "It's not what most people expect when they hear family farm," Sarah explained as they stopped by a state-of-the-art greenhouse. "We've had to adapt over the years. My husband Tom started our organic certification process before he passed away 5 years ago. Since then, we've developed partnerships with local restaurants, started a CSA program, and even host educational programs for schools." Victoria felt a sudden pang of guilt, remembering the cold financial reports that had dismissed Harrison Farm as underperforming and ripe for development. The numbers hadn't mentioned the innovation she was seeing, or the passionate intelligence in Sarah's eyes as she discussed soil regeneration techniques. Their tour ended at the farmhouse kitchen, where Sarah insisted on sharing a cup of coffee. Victoria found herself seated at a well-worn wooden table, watching as Sarah moved efficiently around the space, pulling home-baked cookies from a vintage ceramic jar. The kitchen was nothing like the sleek, untouched one in her penthouse. This one showed signs of constant use: fresh herbs drying from ceiling racks, children's artwork magnetized to the refrigerator, a recipe book so well used its pages were butter-stained and dog-eared. It felt like the heart of a home, not a showpiece. "Mom, is there any more of that apple cider left?" A teenage girl burst through the back door, stopping short when she saw Victoria. "Oh, sorry, I didn't know we had company." "Emma, this is Mrs. Maxwell," Sarah introduced. "Mrs. Maxwell, my daughter Emma. She's the one who manages our social media and online sales." Victoria watched as Emma pulled out her phone and quickly pulled up the farm's Instagram page. It was nothing like the polished influencer-style posts Victoria was used to, but the authenticity of the content was striking. Real people doing real work, celebrating small victories, sharing setbacks and learnings with their community. As she sipped her coffee and listened to mother and daughter discuss their plans for the upcoming harvest festival, Victoria felt something shift inside her. These women weren't just surviving on this farm, they were thriving in their own way. Their wealth couldn't be measured in dollars or square footage, but in the richness of their relationship, the pride in their work, and the depth of their connection to this land. For the first time in years, Victoria felt like she was seeing something real, something that all her money and social status couldn't buy. As she prepared to leave, Sarah pressed a jar of homemade apple butter into her hands. "A little taste of Harrison Farm," she said with a smile. "Sometimes the sweetest things in life are the simplest." Driving back to New York that evening, Victoria couldn't shake the feeling that she had stumbled upon something important. The jar of apple butter sat in her passenger seat like a treasure, a tangible reminder of a world where worth wasn't measured in stock portfolios and social media followers, but in the soil beneath your feet and the love around your table. Back in New York, Victoria found herself unable to focus on her usual routine. The stark contrast between her world and the authentic life she'd witnessed at Harrison Farm consumed her thoughts. During a charity board meeting at Le Bernardin, she caught herself staring at her untouched $200 lunch while thinking about the simple, flavorful tomatoes she'd tasted from Sarah's garden. Richard noticed her distraction during one of their rare shared breakfasts. "How was the farm inspection?" he asked, his attention divided between his tablet and his protein shake. "The development team needs your sign-off on the preliminary report." Victoria set down her coffee cup carefully. "I think we need to look at this differently," she began, choosing her words with care. "Harrison Farm isn't what we thought. They're actually quite innovative in their approach to sustainable agriculture. They have educational programs, community partnerships." "Vic," Richard interrupted, using his business voice, the one that brooked no argument. "The numbers don't lie. That property is worth 10 times more as a luxury development than as a working farm. It's simple economics." But for the first time in their marriage, Victoria pushed back. "What if there was another way? What if we could invest in the farm instead of destroying it?" The words tumbled out before she could stop them. "I could oversee it personally, work with Sarah, Mrs. Harrison, to expand their programs, maybe create a model for sustainable farming that could—" Richard's laugh cut her off. "You? Oversee a farm? Darling, you've never worked a day in your life. Let's stick to what we know." He stood, straightening his bespoke suit. "Have the report on my desk by Friday." But his dismissal had the opposite effect than intended. That afternoon, Victoria found herself doing something she hadn't done in years: actual research. She dove into studies about sustainable agriculture, read about successful farm-to-table businesses, and examined the growing market for organic produce in urban areas. The next day, she made an unexpected return trip to Harrison Farm, this time armed with a proposal of her own. She found Sarah in the greenhouse, teaching a group of elementary school children about hydroponics. Watching Sarah interact with the children, Victoria was struck by how naturally leadership came to this woman. She waited until the class ended before approaching. "Do you have a moment to talk?" she asked, suddenly nervous in a way she hadn't been since her museum curator days. Over another cup of coffee at the familiar kitchen table, Victoria laid out her idea. Instead of selling the farm, what if Sarah would consider a partnership? Victoria would invest personally, not through Richard's company Backpath, to help expand the educational programs, upgrade equipment, and develop new revenue streams. In return, she wanted to learn everything she could about running a sustainable farm. Sarah listened carefully, her expression thoughtful. "It's an interesting proposal," she said finally. "But why? Why would you want to get involved in something so far removed from your world?" Victoria found herself struggling to put her feelings into words. "Because this place is real," she said finally. Everything here has purpose, has meaning. In my world, everything is about appearance, about the next big deal, about impressing people you don't even like. I need something real in my life again. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying Victoria with those keen eyes that seemed to see right through her carefully maintained facade. "It won't be easy," she said finally. "This isn't something you can delegate or manage from a distance. If you want to learn about farming, you'll need to get your hands dirty." Literally. "I know," Victoria replied, surprising herself with how much she meant it. "I'm ready for that." They spent the next few hours hammering out details. Victoria would come to the farm 3 days a week to learn every aspect of the operation. She would invest in expanding the greenhouse program and developing an artisanal food line using the farm's produce. Sarah would maintain full operational control while teaching Victoria everything she knew about sustainable farming. As they shook hands on their agreement, neither woman could have predicted how this unlikely partnership would change both their lives. Victoria left the farm that day with soil under her manicured nails and a lightness in her heart she hadn't felt in years. The drive back to New York felt different this time. She knew there would be challenges ahead, not least of which would be explaining this new venture to Richard. But for the first time in as long as she could remember, Victoria felt like she was moving toward something real, something meaningful. As she watched the sun setting over the Manhattan skyline, she realized that she'd found something she didn't even know she was looking for. A purpose beyond the perfect Instagram post. A challenge beyond planning the next charity gala, and most importantly, a chance to prove to herself and everyone else that she was more than just a billionaire's trophy wife. The jar of apple butter still sat on her kitchen counter untouched. Tonight, she decided she would open it. It would be her first taste of a new beginning. Over the next few months, Victoria's life transformed in ways she never could have imagined. Her pristine designer clothes were gradually supplemented by a growing collection of practical workwear. Her perfectly manicured hands began to show the signs of real work, though she still maintained her weekly manicure appointments. Much to her regular technician's bewilderment, the changes weren't just physical. Victoria found herself waking up eager to drive to the farm, her mind already planning the day ahead. She threw herself into learning everything she could, approaching each task with the same determination she'd once applied to climbing New York's social ladder. Sarah proved to be a patient but demanding teacher. She started Victoria with the basics, understanding the soil, learning about crop rotation, mastering the intricacies of the greenhouse environment. "Farming isn't just about growing plants," Sarah would say. "It's about understanding the entire ecosystem." One particularly memorable morning, Victoria arrived at the farm just as the sun was rising, ready to help with the harvest for their weekly restaurant deliveries. She was dressed in her new work boots and durable pants, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, a far cry from the socialite who had first driven up the farm's gravel driveway. "You're getting better at this," Sarah commented as they worked together, watching Victoria efficiently check each tomato for ripeness before picking. "You've got the touch now. You're not just looking, you're feeling, sensing." Victoria smiled, remembering her first awkward attempts at harvesting, how she'd been so afraid of getting dirty that she'd barely touched the plants. Now she found peace in the rhythmic work, pride in the soil under her nails. "I never thought I'd say this, but I love being here early like this. The city never feels this alive." Their partnership began to bear fruit beyond the fields. Victoria's business acumen, combined with Sarah's farming expertise, proved to be a powerful combination. They launched a line of premium organic products under the Harrison Farm brand, with packaging designed by one of Victoria's artist friends. The farm's Instagram account, now a collaboration between Emma's authentic farm content and Victoria's marketing knowledge, saw its following grow exponentially. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Victoria still struggled to balance her two worlds. Richard grew increasingly frustrated with her new passion, especially when she missed important social events because she was working at the farm. "You're becoming obsessed," he accused one evening after she skipped a crucial networking dinner. "This isn't who you are, Victoria." "Maybe it's who I've always been," she replied quietly, realizing as she said it how true it was. You just never knew that person. The farm became her refuge, not just from her hollow social life, but from the growing tension in her marriage. She found herself confiding in Sarah during their lunch breaks, sharing things she'd never told her supposed best friends in the city. One rainy afternoon, as they sorted seeds in the barn, Sarah shared more about her own journey. After Tom died, everyone said I should sell the farm, she recalled, her hands moving steadily through the seeds. Said a woman couldn't run a place like this alone. But this land? It's more than just property. It's my children's heritage, their future. It's where Tom and I built our dreams. Victoria felt a deep resonance with these words. I used to think success meant having the biggest house, the most exclusive possessions, she admitted. Now I'm not so sure anymore. The farm's educational programs flourished under their joint leadership. Victoria's connections brought in funding and attention, while Sarah's expertise gave the programs substance and authenticity. They started hosting workshops for urban professionals interested in sustainable living, combining Victoria's understanding of her former world with Sarah's practical knowledge. Emma, Sarah's daughter, bloomed under Victoria's mentoring in business and marketing, while teaching Victoria in return about genuine social media engagement. Their positions as teacher and student often reversed, creating a beautiful dynamic of mutual learning and respect. As autumn turned to winter, Victoria found herself spending more and more time at the farm. She learned about winter crop planning, greenhouse management, and the quiet work of preparing for spring. The rhythm of farm life began to feel more natural than her old schedule of endless social engagements. One snowy evening, as Victoria prepared to drive back to the city, Sarah handed her a warm loaf of freshly baked bread. You know, Sarah said thoughtfully, when you first showed up here in those designer heels, I never thought I'd say this. But you've become a real farmer, Victoria. Not just someone playing at it. A real one. The words brought unexpected tears to Victoria's eyes. In all her years in New York, with all her social achievements and material success, no compliment had ever meant more to her than the simple recognition of her hard work and dedication. As she drove home through the gathering darkness, the warm bread beside her filling the car with its homey scent, Victoria realized that she had found something she'd been searching for all her life without knowing it. Not just purpose, but belonging. The woman who had once measured her worth in carats and square footage now found herself valuing the weight of a good harvest and the strength of her own two hands. Little did she know that this peaceful evolution was about to face its greatest test, as forces beyond her control were gathering to challenge everything she had built at Harrison Farm. The catalyst came on an unseasonably warm March morning. Victoria had arrived early at the farm to help prepare for their first major organic food showcase, an event that would bring together high-end restaurateurs and sustainability-focused investors. She'd spent weeks leveraging her social connections to ensure the right people would attend, carefully bridging her two worlds. As she pulled up to the farmhouse, she noticed an unfamiliar black SUV parked in the driveway. Through the kitchen window, she could see Sarah sitting at the table with two men in suits, a sight as out of place at Harrison Farm as a tractor would be in the Maxwells' penthouse living room. Victoria's heart sank as she recognized one of the men, James Porter, Richard's head of development. She hadn't told Richard about her personal investment in the farm, maintaining the fiction that she was still gathering information for his company's development plans. Now, seeing James here, she felt her carefully constructed world beginning to crumble. She entered through the back door, the familiar creak of its hinges sounding somehow ominous today. Sarah looked up, her face uncharacteristically pale. "Victoria," she said, her voice steady but strained. "I think you should hear this." James Porter stood, straightening his expensive suit with a practiced motion. "Mrs. Maxwell," he said, his corporate smile never reaching his eyes. "How unexpected to find you here. Mr. Maxwell hadn't mentioned you were involved in the negotiations." "Negotiations?" Victoria repeated, looking between Sarah and the men. Sarah, the second man, whom Victoria didn't recognize, cleared his throat. We were just explaining to Mrs. Harrison that Maxwell Development has acquired the outstanding loan on Harrison Farm from Agricultural Bank. Given the farm's current financial situation, we are prepared to offer a very generous settlement package. Victoria felt as if the floor had dropped out from under her. The loan, of course. Sarah had mentioned it once, an old mortgage taken out for equipment upgrades before Tom's death. But with Victoria's investment and their new initiatives, they'd been making all the payments on time. "We're not behind on any payments," Sarah said firmly, echoing Victoria's thoughts. "The farm is doing better than ever." James's smile turned predatory. "Perhaps, but the loan terms give us the right to call in the full amount at any time, and Mr. Maxwell feels this would be the perfect time to exercise that option." Victoria's mind raced. Richard must have discovered her involvement, must have realized she was actually helping the farm succeed rather than preparing it for his development plans. This was his way of taking control, a hostile takeover wrapped in legal banker's language. She watched Sarah's hands, those capable hands that had taught her so much about farming and life, clench into fists on the worn kitchen table. This table where they'd shared countless meals, planned the farm's future, laughed and worried and dreamed. And now these men in their suits were here to end it all with a few signatures on legal papers. "How much?" Victoria asked suddenly. James raised an eyebrow. "The remaining loan balance is $2.4 million. Of course, given the circumstances, we're prepared to offer Mrs. Harrison a very generous—" "I'll pay it," Victoria interrupted. "Right now. I'll buy out the loan." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah stared at her, eyes wide. James's corporate mask slipped for just a moment, showing genuine surprise. "Mrs. Maxwell," he began carefully, "I don't think you understand. This isn't just about the loan. Mr. Maxwell has plans for this property. The development project is already in motion. The contractors are—" "I don't care about Richard's plans," Victoria cut him off, her voice quiet but firm. "This is my money for my family's trust. Richard has no claim on it." She turned to Sarah. "If you'll accept me as your creditor instead of the bank, the farm stays exactly as it is." Looking into Sarah's eyes, Victoria saw something she'd never expected, respect tinged with concern. "Victoria," Sarah said softly, "you don't have to do this. This fight with your husband—" "This isn't about Richard," Victoria interrupted, suddenly understanding the truth of her own words. "This is about what's right, what matters." She turned back to James. "You can tell my husband that if he wants to fight me on this, I'm prepared to make it very public. I wonder how his investors would feel about him trying to destroy a successful, sustainable farming operation, one that employs local workers, feeds the community, and educates children." James's face tightened. He knew as well as she did how damaging that kind of publicity could be to Maxwell Development's carefully crafted image of corporate responsibility. "I'll need to consult with Mr. Maxwell," he said stiffly. "Do that," Victoria replied. "And while you're at it, tell him I won't be home for dinner. I have a farm to run." After the men left, Sarah and Victoria sat in silence at the kitchen table. Finally, Sarah spoke. "You just declared war on your husband for this farm. Why?" Victoria looked around the warm, lived-in kitchen, thinking of everything she'd learned here, everything she'd become. "Because this place taught me what real value is," she said simply. "And some things are worth fighting for." What she didn't say, what she was only beginning to understand herself, was that in defending Harrison Farm, she was also fighting for her own transformation, her own liberation from the gilded cage she'd lived in for so long. The battle ahead would test not just her resolve, but everything she thought she knew about herself, her marriage, and what truly makes a life worth living. The aftermath of Victoria's confrontation with Richard's development team sent ripples through both her worlds. In the days that followed, she found herself navigating an increasingly complex emotional landscape, torn between the life she'd built and the life she was discovering. Richard's response came swiftly, first through his lawyers, who sent lengthy emails questioning the legality of her using her trust fund for such an investment, then through their social circle, where whispers began circulating about Victoria's mental state and her unfortunate obsession with playing farmer. Even their shared financial advisor called, gently suggesting that she reconsider her impulsive decision. But it was Richard's personal response that cut deepest. He simply went silent. The man who had once filled her phone with messages now communicated only through intermediaries. Their sprawling penthouse became a maze of avoided encounters and carefully timed exits and entrances. One evening, as Victoria sat alone in their kitchen, still pristine, still unused, she found herself staring at her reflection in the polished surface of their sub-zero refrigerator. The woman looking back at her seemed caught between two worlds, designer clothes and dirt under her fingernails, expensive jewelry and calloused hands. She thought about Sarah's words from that morning at the farm. They'd been checking the new greenhouse irrigation system when Sarah had asked, "Are you sure you're ready for what's coming?" Richard won't give up easily. Victoria had been monitoring the water pressure gauges, a task that would have been unthinkable to her 6 months ago. "I keep asking myself that," she'd admitted. Everything was so clear in that moment, standing up to James Porter. But now, I've known these people my whole adult life, Richard for 7 years. Sometimes I wake up wondering if I've gone crazy. Sarah had adjusted a valve before responding. "You know what my father used to say about farming? He said the hardest part isn't the physical work. It's trusting what you know to be true, even when everyone else thinks you're wrong. Like when every farmer in the county is planting one way, but you know your land needs something different." Now, in her silent kitchen, Victoria pulled out her phone and scrolled through her recent photos. They told the story of her transformation, close-ups of sprouting seeds she'd planted herself, proud shots of her first successfully harvested crops, candid moments of farm life caught between the work. She lingered on one that Emma had taken without her knowing. Victoria was laughing, hair messy, face smudged with dirt, looking more alive than she'd ever appeared in any society photographer's careful compositions. The contrast with her current surroundings struck her forcefully. Everything in this penthouse was for show, carefully curated to impress others. Even the fruit in the bowl before her was chosen for appearance rather than taste, replaced weekly by their housekeeper whether eaten or not. Her phone buzzed, a text from one of her oldest friends, Caroline. "Darling, everyone's worried about you. This farming phase. Richard is just trying to protect you from yourself. Why don't we meet at La Grenouille tomorrow? Like old times." Victoria stared at the message, remembering countless lunches at that very restaurant, the careful dance of social politics, the endless discussions of who was wearing what and who was seeing whom. Had that really been her life for so long? She started typing a response, then stopped. How could she explain that the farming phase had awakened something real in her, that for the first time in years, she felt purposeful, alive, that the dirt under her nails felt more authentic than all the manicures she'd ever had? The internal struggle wasn't just about the farm anymore. It was about who she was becoming, who she perhaps had always been beneath the polished exterior. The woman who had once spent hours debating the shade of white for their penthouse walls now found herself fascinated by the different textures of soil, the intricate patterns of plant growth, the complex dance of natural systems. That night, unable to sleep, Victoria went up to their rarely used roof garden. Richard had installed it as another status symbol. Organic herbs were trendy among their set, but no one ever actually tended it. Looking at the neglected plants, she found herself automatically checking the soil moisture, noting which herbs needed pruning, seeing the potential in the space. She realized then that she couldn't go back. The knowledge she'd gained, the connection she'd found to the earth and to herself, had changed her too fundamentally. The question wasn't whether she was ready for what was coming. It was whether her old world was ready for who she had become. As dawn broke over the city, Victoria made a decision. She would stop trying to bridge her two worlds. The path ahead was clear, even if it meant walking it alone. She took off her wedding ring, placing it on the breakfast bar with a note. Richard, I choose the farm. I choose myself. What she didn't write, but what they both would soon learn, was that this choice would set in motion events that would shake both their worlds to their foundations, forcing everyone involved to question what truly matters in a life well lived. The confrontation Victoria had been dreading arrived on a rain-soaked Thursday morning. She was in the greenhouse with Sarah, teaching a group of urban schoolchildren about organic farming methods, when Richard's familiar black Bentley pulled up the muddy driveway, followed by two more vehicles carrying his legal team. The children were gathering around a tomato plant, their small faces bright with wonder as Victoria explained how the bees helped pollinate the flowers. She saw Sarah tense at the sight of the approaching entourage, but kept her voice steady as she finished the lesson. "Mrs. Harrison," Richard's voice cut through the greenhouse like a steel blade. "I need to speak with my wife. Privately." Victoria straightened up, soil still clinging to her knees from where she'd been kneeling with the children. "Whatever you have to say, Richard, you can say it here. Sarah is my business partner." The look of distaste on Richard's face as he surveyed the greenhouse, at his wife's dirty jeans, at the curious faces of the schoolchildren, at Sarah's protective stance, spoke volumes. "Very well. Your little experiment has gone far enough. I've been patient, thinking you'd come to your senses, but this ends today." "You're right about one thing," Victoria replied, her voice calm despite her racing heart. "This does end today, but not the way you think." Richard pulled out a folder, expensive paper crisp despite the humid greenhouse air. "I've frozen your trust fund accounts. The Board of Trustees agrees that your recent behavior shows questionable judgment. Until you agree to psychological evaluation and appropriate treatment, your access to those funds will remain restricted." Sarah took a step forward, but Victoria raised a hand to stop her. The children were being quietly ushered out by their teacher, wide-eyed at the drama unfolding. "You really don't understand, do you?" Victoria said, looking at her husband, really looking at him, perhaps for the first time in years. "This isn't about the money. This is about something real, something alive, something you've forgotten how to see." "What I see," Richard snapped, "is my wife playing farmer, embarrassing herself and, by extension, me. Do you have any idea what this little fantasy of yours is doing to our reputation, to our social standing?" Victoria laughed, a genuine, unbridled sound that seemed to startle everyone in the greenhouse. "Our social standing. Richard, look around you. These plants don't care about our social standing. The earth doesn't care about our reputation. This farm feeds people, educates children, makes a real difference in the world. When was the last time one of our charity galas actually changed anything?" "You've lost your mind," Richard said quietly, dangerously. "And if you won't protect yourself from this delusion, then I'll have to do it for you." He nodded to one of his lawyers, who stepped forward with another document. "This is a court order for a psychological evaluation. Either you come home now and agree to treatment, or I'll be forced to take more drastic legal action." The greenhouse fell silent, except for the gentle patter of rain on the glass roof. Victoria looked around at the space she'd come to love, the neat rows of seedlings she'd helped plant, the innovative irrigation system she and Sarah had designed together, the educational displays she'd created for the children's programs. "No," she said simply. Richard blinked. "No?" "No," Victoria repeated, stronger now. "I won't be evaluated. I won't come home, and I won't give up this farm. In fact," she took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders, "I want a divorce." The word hung in the air like a thunderclap. Richard's face went through a rapid series of emotions: shock, anger, calculation, and finally, cold determination. "You're making a terrible mistake," he said. "Think carefully about what you're throwing away. The lifestyle you're accustomed to, your position in society, your entire world." "I'm not throwing anything away," Victoria interrupted. "I'm choosing something better, something real." She gestured to Sarah and the farm around them. "This is my world now. And if you try to destroy it, I'll fight you with everything I have." Richard's face hardened. "You won't win. You have no idea what you're up against. Neither do you." Sarah spoke up suddenly, her quiet voice carrying unexpected authority. "You see a business opportunity, a real estate deal. We see a legacy, a community, a future. You're not just fighting Victoria anymore. You're fighting all of us." Richard looked between the two women, seeming to realize for the first time that he faced not just his wayward wife, but a united front. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the greenhouse, his expensive shoes squelching in the mud. She began keeping a journal, something she hadn't done since college. Late at night, by the light of a single lamp, she wrote about her journey, her fears, her discoveries. "I'm learning that strength isn't about never being afraid," she wrote one evening. "It's about being afraid and moving forward anyway." The local community, unlike her city friends, gradually began to accept her. Not as Mrs. Maxwell, the billionaire's wife, but as Victoria, the woman who worked hard and was trying to learn. The elderly couple at the general store started saving boxes of mason jars for her canning experiments. The local diner owner asked her advice about starting a kitchen garden. Small kindnesses, but they meant more to her than any society invitation ever had. Sarah and Emma became her lifeline during this period. They never pushed, never demanded, simply included her in their daily routines. Sunday dinners at the farmhouse became a tradition, filled with laughter and simple, honest conversation. Victoria learned to make pie crust from Sarah, while Emma taught her how to capture the perfect sunrise photo for their farm's social media. One evening, about a month into her new life, Victoria found herself explaining crop rotation to a group of visiting agricultural students. In the middle of her explanation about soil health and sustainable farming practices, she caught her reflection in the greenhouse glass. The woman she saw there was sunburned, hair escaping from its ponytail, gesturing enthusiastically about nitrogen-fixing plants, and radiating genuine joy. That night, she wrote in her journal, "I used to think isolation meant being alone. Now I understand that I was never more isolated than when I was surrounded by people who couldn't see the real me, because I couldn't see her either. In losing everything, I'm finally finding myself." The legal battles with Richard were far from over, and the path ahead was still uncertain. But in the quiet moments of her new life, Victoria was discovering a truth that no court could challenge. Sometimes you have to lose your place in the world to find where you truly belong. The turning point came unexpectedly, on a crisp autumn morning exactly 1 year after Victoria's first visit to Harrison Farm. She was in the middle of harvesting pumpkins with a group of local children when a familiar black car appeared on the horizon. This time, however, Richard emerged alone. Victoria straightened up, brushing dirt from her jeans, aware of how different she must look from the polished socialite she'd been when he last saw her. A year of physical work had changed her. She was stronger now, her designer clothes replaced by well-worn work gear, her once perfect manicure long gone. "The children's program seems to be doing well," Richard said by way of greeting, looking around at the bustling farm activity. His tone was different, less hostile, more curious. "We're teaching them about sustainable agriculture and healthy eating," Victoria replied cautiously. "Would you like to see what we've accomplished?" To her surprise, Richard nodded. As they walked the property, Victoria found herself sharing their achievements with growing enthusiasm. The expanded greenhouse program, the successful organic certification, the educational partnerships with local schools. Richard listened silently, his expression unreadable. They reached the new community garden area, where elderly residents were working alongside teenagers, sharing knowledge and stories as they tended their plots. "This is what you were trying to tell me about, wasn't it?" Richard said suddenly. "That day in the greenhouse. About things that matter." Victoria felt something shift in her chest. "Yes," she said simply. "This isn't just about growing food. It's about growing community, growing understanding. It's about creating something real." Richard was quiet for a long moment, watching a young girl carefully water her first tomato plant under the guidance of an elderly neighbor. "I've been doing some thinking," he finally said. "A lot of thinking, actually. The development plans for this area, they don't make sense anymore." Victoria held her breath, hardly daring to hope. Richard continued, "I've been looking at the numbers differently. Not just the profit margins, but the impact metrics. What you and Sarah have built here, the educational programs, the community involvement, the sustainable practices, it's actually more valuable in the long term than another luxury development." He turned to face her fully. "I was wrong, Victoria. Not just about the farm, but about you. I thought you were having some kind of breakdown, but you were actually having a breakthrough. You saw something I couldn't see." Tears pricked at Victoria's eyes, but she blinked them back. "What are you saying, Richard?" "Richard, I'm saying I'd like to help if you'll let me. Not to take over, but to support what you're building here. Maxwell Development could establish a foundation for sustainable agriculture education, using Harrison Farm as a model. We could help other small farms transition to sustainable practices, expand the educational programs to other communities." Victoria studied his face, looking for any sign of manipulation or ulterior motives. What she saw instead was something she hadn't seen in years: genuine emotion, real vulnerability. "What changed?" she asked softly. Richard's normally confident demeanor faltered slightly. "I visited my grandfather's farm in Minnesota," he admitted. "The one I used to spend summers at as a kid. It's a shopping center now, standing there watching people push shopping carts across what used to be fields where I helped bring in the harvest. Something broke open inside me. I remembered who I used to be, before everything became about the next deal, the next acquisition." He gestured at the thriving farm around them. "What you've helped create here, it's not just about preserving land or growing food. It's about preserving something essential that we're losing. I see that now." Sarah approached them then, having noticed their lengthy conversation. Richard turned to her with uncharacteristic humility. "Mrs. Harrison, I owe you an apology. Several apologies, actually. I was wrong about this place, wrong about everything." Sarah's response was pure farming wisdom. "Sometimes the best growth comes after the hardest frost, Mr. Maxwell." The three of them spent the next few hours discussing possibilities, not as adversaries, but as potential partners in something larger than themselves. Richard's business acumen, combined with Victoria's passionate vision and Sarah's practical farming knowledge, began to sketch out a future none of them had imagined possible. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the fields, Victoria felt a deep sense of completion. This wasn't just about saving one farm anymore. It was about creating a model for change, a way to bridge the gap between the world she'd left behind and the one she'd found. Looking at Richard's animated face as he discussed sustainable agriculture investment strategies with Sarah, Victoria realized that sometimes the greatest victories come not from defeating an opponent, but from transforming them into an ally. Her journey hadn't just changed her. It had created ripples that were still spreading, touching lives she hadn't even imagined reaching. That evening, as she walked back to her cottage alone, Victoria smiled at the thought of how far she'd come from that first visit to Harrison Farm. She had lost a lifestyle, but found a life. She had sacrificed status but gained purpose. And now, somehow, she had managed to build a bridge between her two worlds, not by compromising her new values, but by staying true to them until others could see their worth. The stars were coming out brighter here than they'd ever been in the city. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new growth. But for now, Victoria simply stood in her garden, breathing in the rich scent of earth and growth, finally completely at peace with who she had become. 3 years later, Harrison Farm had transformed into something beyond anyone's wildest dreams. The original farmhouse still stood proud, its weathered boards now complemented by state-of-the-art sustainable farming facilities. But more than the physical changes, it was the spirit of the place that had evolved into something extraordinary. On a bright summer morning, Victoria stood at the edge of the education center's main hall, watching as Sarah led a workshop for a group of corporate executives, CEOs, and business leaders who had once been part of her old social circle. Now they sat, many in expensive suits that looked amusingly out of place, learning about sustainable agriculture and community-based farming. "It's still strange seeing them here," Richard commented, joining her at the back of the room. He visited regularly now, dividing his time between running Maxwell Development's new Sustainable Agriculture division and helping with the farm's expansion projects. Victoria smiled, watching one of the city's most prominent real estate developers earnestly taking notes about composting techniques. "They're just like I was," she said softly, "looking for something real in a world that often feels artificial." The Harrison Farm model, as it had come to be known, had gained national attention. What started as one woman's journey of transformation had evolved into a blueprint for combining sustainable agriculture with community development and education. They now hosted regular workshops for everyone from school children to corporate leaders, teaching not just farming techniques, but a new way of thinking about success and value. Sarah's daughter, Emma, now in college studying sustainable business practices, had developed an app that connected small farms with local restaurants and consumers. The technology, funded by the Maxwell Foundation, was helping other family farms survive and thrive in the modern economy. Victoria's cottage had grown into a cozy home, its garden now a testing ground for new organic growing techniques. She still lived simply, but her life felt richer than it ever had in the penthouse. The calluses on her hands had become badges of honor, marks of a life lived in connection with the earth and community. Their marriage hadn't survived in its original form, but Victoria and Richard had found a different kind of partnership, one built on shared values and mutual respect rather than social expectations. They worked together now to transform other properties in Maxwell Development's portfolio into sustainable community spaces, each project learning from and building upon the success of Harrison Farm. As Sarah's workshop ended, Victoria watched the executives file out, many lingering to examine the hydroponic systems or ask questions about implementing similar programs in their own communities. One woman, who Victoria recognized as the CEO of a major investment firm, approached her with tears in her eyes. "I get it now," she said simply. "What you saw here, why you chose this. I've spent 20 years chasing the next big deal, and this is the first time in ages I've felt peaceful." Victoria squeezed her hand in understanding. "The farm has a way of teaching you what really matters," she replied. "Sometimes you have to get your hands dirty to clean your perspective." Later that afternoon, Victoria sat with Sarah on the farmhouse porch, sharing their traditional end-of-day tea. They watched as a new group of community members tended their plots in the expanded community garden, children running between the rows, elderly mentors sharing their wisdom with young families. "Did you ever imagine this?" Sarah asked, gesturing at the thriving scene before them. "That first day you drove up in your designer heels?" Victoria laughed, remembering how out of place she'd felt. "Never. I thought I was just inspecting a property. Instead, I found my purpose." "You found more than that," Sarah corrected gently. "You found your truth. And in sharing it, you helped others find theirs." As the sun set over Harrison Farm, casting golden light across the fields they'd worked so hard to preserve and nurture, Victoria reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She had lost what she thought was everything, only to gain what truly mattered. Her designer clothes had been replaced by work boots, her social status by genuine respect, her hollow success by meaningful purpose. But the real transformation wasn't in what she'd lost or gained. It was in how she'd learned to measure wealth, not in dollars or square footage, but in the richness of relationships, the satisfaction of honest work, and the joy of creating something that made the world a little better. The farm had taught her that true abundance grows not from what you possess, but from what you nurture. That real success isn't about rising above others, but about growing together. And most importantly, that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let go of everything you thought you wanted to embrace what your heart knows you need. As twilight deepened into night, The fireflies began their dance over the fields, nature's own celebration of life and light. Victoria smiled, feeling completely at home in her skin, in her purpose, in her truth. She had found what everyone in those corporate boardrooms and luxury penthouses was really looking for. Not just success, but significance. Not just achievement, but fulfillment. And as the stars appeared above Harrison Farm, their light seemed to whisper an ancient truth. Sometimes you have to lose your place in the world to find where you truly belong, and sometimes the richest harvest comes not from what you take, but from what you dare to give.